Welcome, everyone. Welcome, everyone. Your Worship, Mayor Ireland, Council, Mr. Gibbon, members of the administration staff, and also welcome to all the participating public who is joining us virtually. As far as, if all goes well, this might be the last virtual meeting for a while. The council will be scheduled to resume in-person meeting next week as the next council meeting. However, the option for virtual viewing will remain as far as I understand. Council, the agenda package has been previously circulated, and prior to the approval of the agenda, I would like to call the meeting to order. And secondly, prior to approving the agenda, are there any changes, deletions, additions to the agenda? Councillor Demora.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Journeau, and it's an honor to have you chair the meeting. So nice to see you here again. I would like to add an addition of under new business 8.4, and just to have a request for a paid parking update, and we'll have a discussion then at that for our regular meeting in the following week, if that's okay.
I will accept that. Any other changes, additions? There being none, may I have a motion to approve the agenda? Councillor Demona, thank you. Anybody opposed? That is carried. Next item is the approval of the minutes that were previously circulated. Minutes of the meeting June 22nd, 2021. May I have a motion to approve those minutes? All at once. May I have a motion to approve the minutes? Thank you, Councillor Kelleher, MP. All in favor? Oops. Thank you. Item number 5 is presentations. I don't see anyone scheduled. Do we have anybody, Mr. Gibbon? No, thank you very much. We'll go to item number 6. Business arising from the minutes of the June 22nd, 21 minutes, or meeting minutes, sorry. Any business arising? Please and thank you. Then we'll move on to item 7, policy and governance. Council strategic priorities update, and that is a verbal presentation. Mr. Gibbon, I suspect.
Thanks very much, Deputy Mayor Journeau. The Council strategic priorities and business plan are attached for Council and the community's information. You'll see as we go through the reports that we try to ensure that all reports demonstrate their alignment with Council strategic priorities. And so there isn't a specific update on the priorities at this time, but in each report you will see the relationship of administration's recommendations to Council strategic priorities.
Thank you. Any comments? Questions? Too quiet. All right, move on to item 8, I guess. New business. Item 8.1, targeted boards and committees review. There's an attachment in the package. Who's speaking to that? Thank you.
I will just provide a very brief contextual introduction, and then I'm actually going to pass it on to Ms. Nadan, who led the development of the report along with Ms. Riddell. So back in January, Council directed administration to conduct a review of a targeted review of specific boards and committees, specifically the Jasper Community Team, Community Conversations, the Environmental Responsibility Committee, and the Culture and Rec Board. This report is in response to that council direction, And overall, administration is attempting to find a way to achieve the best out of all the different approaches that we're currently using in these three areas. And Ms. Nadon will lead through the discussion of the report. Christine.
Thank you, Mr. Given. Good morning, Deputy Mayor Journeau and Council. As Mr. Given indicated, this is a follow-up from a direction from Council to conduct a targeted review of boards and committees. And so essentially, the matter is outlined in the discussion. So the options before Council at this time. So administration is recommending that that committee direct administration to draft a community conversation policy to present it at a future meeting. And we've purposely left out the areas of focus for those areas. So Council could discuss that once there's a bit more of a framework around the policy, if that's the decision that happens today. So essentially, the Municipal Government Act says that council boards and committees have to be established by bylaw. And this provides a pretty rigid context to public engagement in the form of boards and committees. And then those terms of reference become part of the bylaw. The approach we're suggesting to bring forward a community conversation policy falls more in the strategy realm than the formal boards and committees. And it would become a public engagement strategy where there would be a bit more flexibility around the outcomes, around how business is conducted, what the focus is, what the relationship is, and the information flow between the people that are participating in those initiatives. And so they wouldn't be considered a formal board or committee, and therefore could be governed by policy. And so our intention would be that the areas of focus for those community conversations would be included in the policy statement, which would allow council to vary them depending on what's happening and what the priorities of the day might be. And that policy would be easier to update. And then the admin procedures would be administration's role to develop, to be approved by the CAO, would provide that consistency and clarity organization-wide that we're currently seeing that the community conversations as part of the Jasper community team are working well, are effective, but are not documented in our municipal process. And therefore the flow of information to council and how it relates administratively, developing that through procedures that would apply not only to the Jasper community team community conversations, but to other areas that council may select, which on the basis of the information we have, that might be culture and rec and environmental responsibility. But establishing that community conversations process more formally through policy and procedures is the recommendation that we are bringing forward today. Like I said, areas of focus could be further discussed. And if the direction is for administration to come back with a draft policy, we could then at the next conversation go a bit more in depth about what those areas are. But that is the discussion before council today, is whether a community conversations approach defined by policy would be satisfactory and would meet our goals, or whether we should turn back to a more formal approach that would be by bylaw, terms of reference, and just updating those would be the option, I guess, or not taking any further action, which, understanding that this has been a topic in front of council, this might not be the desired option. And then we just provided a brief table outlining the purpose, composition, whether there's terms of reference, whether boards or committees have decision-making. So that's in the report here. As well as we've attached the current terms of reference for the Culture and Rec Board, which is an excerpt from the procedure bylaw. So I'll leave it at that. Happy to take questions. Mrs. Riddell is also on the line if there's questions more specifically about how community conversations work currently, but we are here to take any questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Merci, Mademoiselle Nadon. Councillor Demora was first to have his hand up. Go ahead.
Thank you, and I appreciate the document that we have here today and the work behind it. I just need it dumbed down. So to take all the legislative jargon out of there, basically we're copying the community conversations model as the approach from the community team, So the idea is to copy what we have and build another structure and have both operating at the same time. So we would have community conversations still exist as part of the community team arm, and then copy that and have our other boards and committees, or just committees, or have the topics under the community conversations model and call it something else or whatever. I'd like some clarity on that one.
Mr. Given?
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Jeannot, to Councillor Demota. To be really direct, Councillor Demota, what administration is recommending is really bringing together the two approaches to get the best of both worlds. Community conversations, as currently constructed, are effective and appreciated by the community in terms of the level of engagement, but they are not particularly effective in terms of information flow. And council's ability to decide a focus area. On the other hand, the Culture and Rec Board is well defined, but somewhat rigid and maybe not as free flowing as council and the community would like to see. So what administration is recommending is improving the community conversations model by providing more definition through policy, while not becoming so rigid as the Culture and Rec Board is today. The intent there is to try to find the best of both worlds, to allow for good conversation, but also to provide a framework that describes how the information flow will happen, so that council and the community can understand what happens with the input that happens at community conversations. The likely result of this, and we didn't want to show up today with this because council obviously will have some questions and may want to see the policy before making any final determination. But a potential outcome of this would be that council would develop a community conversation policy, that council would identify in that policy the focus of community conversations, which may include the current Jasper community team and could include other focus areas. Ms. Nadon mentioned environmental responsibility, so a community conversation around environmental responsibility. It could include a community conversation around culture and recreation issues. If council chose that approach, a likely recommendation from administration would be to disband the Culture and Recreation Board and transition it to a community conversation on culture and rec. So but we weren't there yet to say, hey, get rid of the CNR board, because we're not clear yet the council is supportive of moving to this community conversations model as an overall approach. I hope that helps.
Thank you for that, Mr. Given. I see Councillor Demota has his hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, just to follow up, and just maybe to provide the community and the people that may watch this with a little bit of clarity behind the Culture and Rec Board. That was established prior to council achieving autonomy. And it served a different purpose at the time, and that's why it's so rigidly structured in that way. But I think that there's an opportunity to hybrid both, and as Ms. Nadon had explained through terms of reference and having a different type of structure, I think that for my personal opinion, we could have the community conversations model, and maybe not have a bunch of different topics on a day that we're going to discuss this and that, but have different days so people can take the energy to tune in, so to speak, or know that this day is coming up, and that specific day is for environmental responsibility or culture and rec and things like that. So I like this, and I'm looking forward to further discussion and insight from other councillors on this. Thank you.
Thank you for that. Any more comments, follow up? When I looked at the package, I noticed that there was a reference to the green space. And at first I was wondering why it was included in there, and you have not commented on it, but I see it says targeted boards. So those are the two that were targeted for today's review. Am I correct? Do we have to speak to three? Sorry. Anybody do we have to speak to the Greenpeace Advisory Committee? Green space, sorry, not the green. Sorry about that. Mademoiselle Nadon.
Thank you, Councillor Journeau. That document is an extract from the procedure bylaw, and that is the Green Space Advisory Committee is not active, and I would suggest that those terms of reference should probably. Well, I don't want to preempt a decision from council for it to be formally rescinded and removed from the bylaw. Clearly, that's a council decision, but that is just the next part of the page following the culture and recreation terms of reference. So the intent of the attachment was to show you the terms of reference for the culture and rec board. It just so happens that Green Space Advisory Committee was next on the list, but that committee is not currently active, and from a housekeeping standpoint, it should drop, but whether that's council's will is a different question. But it to your question more directly, it is not part of today's targeted conversation, or the initial motion we got from council in any event was to look at the Jasper community team, which represents the social community conversation is how we've been referring to it internally, and then environmental responsibility and culture and recreation.
Thank you. Any other comments? I have a question for Mr. Given. You talked about changing the Culture and Rec Board to a community conversation board, if it was a will of council. But what's going to be the input or the information needed for council to make that change? I think if you're a councillor that's sitting on the board, you may have some comments, as Councillor Demota is, but where would that stand right now? Is this coming back to us, or I'm a little...
Yeah. Thanks, Deputy Mayor Journeau. So the report here today and the administrative recommendation is a part of a process. Administration is not showing up today with a recommendation of blow it up and disband things. Administration is showing up today with a recommendation that says, if you think this is headed the right direction, then our next step would be to draft a policy for council review and consideration. And then council and council can work on that policy. Once council is satisfied that that policy meets your intent, and if council ultimately accepted that policy or approved that policy, at that time, the Culture and Rec Board may become redundant, and then council could consider formally disbanding it. But we are not here today recommending that. We are here today recommending a step along a process that will allow council to decide if they can appropriately handle the responsibilities of the Culture and Rec Board, and if they can appropriately find a way to engage the community in conversation about culture and recreation issues through a different method. And we are, as administration, we're comfortable in working down that process to explore the method and see if we can get it right before recommending blowing up anything or discontinuing any current committees.
Thank you for that. Councillor Kelleher MP.
Thank you, Mr. Dunn, Mr. Given, and administration for the report. I have a question. I'm curious on the process currently for the community conversations. If a topic, or I'll take for the swim passes back a couple of years ago that came up from the council. I'm interested on the process, how something comes out of community conversation and then gets on the table to council. I'm interested on how that process currently takes place and how, because we know how it happens with Culture and Rec, it's voted on, but I'm kind of curious on how that process works.
Deputy Mayor Journeau for Councillor Kelleher MP. I think Ms. Riddell is probably best positioned to speak to how it works on an ongoing basis, but I'll say at a high level from administration's perspective, it is challenging because it is not a well-defined process. But Ms. Riddell, I'll turn it over to you to sort of speak to what the practice is of how an issue may or may not arrive at the council table from community conversations.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor Journeau through to Councillor Kelleher MP. Thanks for the question and for all of council. Currently, as Mr. Given mentioned, it isn't super formalized, and so it's not necessarily the exact same process each time. But where I've come to after a few years working on this is basically community conversations is where issues and trends, opportunities will come up, and some of those things will have relevant implications for the municipality while others won't. And so my go-to at this point is to summarize items that are being brought up in the Community and Family Services Departmental Report. And if there are items that I can just really see lots of momentum behind, I might consult with my director to see about next steps internally on the administrative side. Ms. Waxer might then consult with Mr. Given, and we would go from there to see whether we should maybe bring something to council. But yeah, as Mr. Given said, I think that right there is an opportunity for us to work on.
Thank you. Mayor Arlen had his hand up. Thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Journeau. Through you, firstly to Mr. Don, thank you for the report, and thank you for all your service as manager of legislative affairs. That's not quite the right title, but in any event, in that capacity, I think your last day today, and congratulations on your promotion, which I think starts tomorrow as a director. So thank you for all of that. We look forward to seeing more of you at our committee meetings and council meetings. I thank you for the report and the comments both by you and Mr. Given. It is a challenge, and I am happy to leave it with you, but the challenge is, can we square the circle, or can we round the edges of the square? And I don't know where it goes for myself. I look forward to some sort of a template that we could use that attempts to combine what I think people accept as the benefit of the community conversations, that is a facilitated discussion that's more free-flowing and less structured, but to combine that somehow with structure. And what I am looking for, if these are to be committees of council, then there has to be some ability, I think, for council to direct some issues to a board or a committee. And that, I think, is perhaps lacking in the community conversation model. It's more a model of discussion and getting people to come forward with ideas, but it's less, I think, a committee of council in the sense that I understand one. On the other hand, the structure that is too regimented, I think, just doesn't get used. So when I read, for example, the excerpt that you have from our current bylaw dealing with the Culture and Recreation Board, it occurs to me that had we actually followed that structure, we might have approached, say, an issue like a new location for the skate park somewhat differently. It seems to me that much of that hard work that is done by your department, Mr. Don, might have been carried forward to a greater extent by a Culture and Recreation Board. Not sure that's necessarily what we want, but we want some sort of a mix. I see it as a real challenge. But to Mr. Given's point, I am in favor personally of inviting you to undertake that challenge and come back with something that models the conversational aspect of community conversations, but within some sort of parameters where it is more clear that this is a council committee and can be expected to undertake work directed to it by council. And that would be for all of the committees that might be structured under this new template. So I appreciate where you're going. I appreciate it's going to take quite a lot more work, but those are sort of the general guidelines that I'm looking for. Thank you for that, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you, Mayor Arlen. Councillor Demora.
Yeah, and you know what, I really appreciate, thank you very much, Deputy Mayor. I appreciate what the mayor has said, and and that's kind of what I spoke to about incorporating both practices and just using this current structure that we might have for committees. And I think because when we go and construct committees and when they're made up of community members, there's people that sign up for that because they have a passion for those specific areas of discussion, and might be something that they're really interested in participating in and helping vet or bring forward discussion. And then having met and coming up with ideas or whatever they feel that is filtered from the community, then coming up with a community conversations where the broader community can come in and chime in on what has come out of those committee discussions, or vice versa, when council directs a committee to have a discussion and then bring it to the broader community that way. So I think there's a process that's there somewhere, and it's just going to be a matter of tweaking with both ideas. And then there might be things that we can bring back to the table. I'm sure, you know, personally from myself, I think we would have had a lot of opportunity to revisit a traffic advisory committee in the last, you know, year or so when it came to paid parking and crosswalks and things like that, because that committee itself was made up of members that incorporated the RCMP, our local fire department, you know, Bylaw, and maybe Parks Canada. So I think that there could be a lot of influential processes that could come to a really decent construct for us. Thank you.
Thanks for that, Councillor Demota. Any other comments, question? Councillor Butler.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Ms. Nadon, Mr. Given, Ms. Riddell, for all of the work on this. Mr. Given asked an implicitly asked a question earlier on. He said if we're in favor of the direction this is going, and I am. I think this is a really good direction. I'm happy to see it. I echo most of the comments the mayor made. It is about finding a line between a community conversations process, which is very open. What I like about that process is that any community member who is interested in an area of discussion or is interested even in a current topic and has interest and expertise to contribute is welcome and can come in and offer perspectives that could be valuable to council. I think that's the great benefit. What I find is a failing of the sort of traditional model of committee structure is that a few members from the community are appointed, and thereafter it is a closed conversation among only those people who were appointed to the committee. And I don't find that to be necessarily very effective. An example was brought up about the skate park, for example. And it's true that council could have pushed questions around the skate park to the Culture and Recreation Committee, but maybe there's no relevant representation from the skateboarding community on that committee. So what does that buy us? So I think there's a lot of potential here, and I agree entirely with the process. I have a question on the RFD in the second page. Culture and Recreation Board is said to have decision-making power, granting specified fee reductions. What does that mean? I wasn't aware that there is decision-making power there. And what is that, granting specified fee reductions?
Sure. Deputy Mayor Journeau, if I may, to Councillor Butler's question. And so not contained in the terms of reference out of the procedure bylaw, but contained separately under another procedure. The Culture and Rec Board has a delegated authority to provide for a waiver of fees up to a certain amount. I would note, and I believe it's items over over $500, but under $2,500. Anything over $2,500 has to come to council, but up to $2,500, the Culture and Rec Board may direct administration to process a waiver of fees. An interesting nuance: they actually have the Culture and Rec Board has a greater fee waiver capacity than I do as CAO. So it was a bit of a funny observation. The maximum that I can do under our bylaws is $1,000. So the Director of Culture and Rec can waive up to $500. I could waive up to $1,000, and the Culture and Rec Board, under the same policy, can waive up to $2,500. So it is an example of how the current structure of the Culture and Rec Board is a bit ambiguous, because you would not know that decision-making authority rests with the Culture and Rec Board by looking at the procedure bylaw. You had to go and find another policy to identify that authority exists.
Councillor Butler.
So thanks very much. That clarifies it with me. You're right. You said you wouldn't know. I didn't. I don't know if any of us did. And that is exactly the kind of issue that we can and should clear up. But it also raises for me a really important distinction when we're talking about committees. We have been having this conversation and using the term committees very generally, but the word can mean a number of different things, but two specific areas. The MGA, as has been pointed out, requires a bylaw to form a committee. What it doesn't say explicitly, but I think is implicit there, is that's required when a committee could have decision-making power. That's how I have looked, I've read through the MGA, and there are a lot of references to committees, and that's why that bar is set high, I believe, because in larger communities especially, committees may be struck which have a lot of delegated power. They could have their own budgets and their ability to spend that budget. And anytime that a council designates a committee to have specific decision-making authority, it has to be done through a bylaw. An example might be in a larger community, for example, a police commission can have a great deal of authority. And we haven't typically done that, and I wasn't even aware of that one situation where that actually is the case. So we need to be clear when we're talking about committees, what we're talking about. And I think our conversation here is largely around what we might call advisory committees. So committees that would have input from the broader community that could provide advice and perspective to council, who would then, based in part on what we're hearing from the committee, make the appropriate decisions. And that's why I think that a community conversation model can be appropriate, as long as we can tackle some of the issues that Mayor Ireland referred to. Council would have the expectation of tasking a committee so that there needs to be a two-way flow and not just a one-way flow. And we have seen examples where that sort of model has worked pretty well. I think the Cannabis Working Group was an example where we didn't call it a community conversation, and it wasn't a fully open process. It was invitational. I don't think we had a scenario where a member who was just interested could phone up and say, well, I want to sit on that task force. But it was quite open, and I think it was really effective in providing advice to council on which we based our decision making. So maybe administration would look back as it works through the work ahead, look back at that as an example of how something somewhat similar to a community conversation model, I think actually worked pretty well. So thanks for the work on this, and I'm really excited and in support of the proposal.
Thank you, Councillor Butler. Councillor Demora.
Yeah, thank you, and very healthy insight. One thing that being on various boards or just various committees in general, one thing that I did discover that what I think would be healthy is to have a copied process for every committee, or if there is going to be a structured committee, to have kind of a welcome package for new members. I know that some of the difficulties in understanding the culture and rec, for an example, because there are many different layers. I didn't know about those types of processes when it came down to waiving fees and having those types of powers until those situations occurred. And just recently we had to do some stuff because of water damage in the gymnastics area of the activity center. And until we asked or asked for clarity on why we're able to do that, a lot of people didn't know because nobody got a welcome package or understood the actual ability or the mandate of that board. So I think having some clarity and similar information packages available for each committee will be helpful down the road. Thank you.
Thank you. Ms. Neto.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Journeau. If I may add, I think I'm sort of building on Councillor Butler's comments that I think from a legislative standpoint, there's a purpose and a terminology discussion that we need to be a bit conscious of. And I think when we refer to committees, the fact that the MGA specifically says committees must be established by bylaw, the terminology we use around a community conversations policy, which then becomes a bit more of an engagement strategy, or however we want to call it, I think we can't really be calling it a committee, because otherwise it needs to be formed by bylaw. And of course, there's more to it than just the terminology. What are the functions that make a body a committee versus a group of people that are providing input to support municipal decision-making is not necessarily a committee. And I think we're sort of navigating that fine line, or I'm hearing wants or outcomes from that process that are somewhere in between. And I think I still stand behind the recommendation that we brought before council to direct administration to draft a policy, which by no means ties council to approving it down the road, but would certainly provide administration the opportunity to reflect a bit more thoroughly on that fine line and that difference. And I think documenting the community conversations process more formally and more in a municipal context, and not only just a social realm, would have its benefits. And then from there, that work, whether it becomes part of terms of references that become part of a bylaw to be a formal committee, could still be an outcome, but also the desire to have a community conversation process that is more clearly defined, that has more specific processes and outcomes attached to it, I think would be beneficial either way. So like I said, I still stand behind the recommendation and think that would help us get to where we want to go without necessarily, I don't think we're quite ready, or from what I'm hearing from the conversations, to make that determination, whether it's a formal committee that's established by bylaw or it's a process that we govern by policy, and that is now clear and precise for everyone to understand. So one doesn't preclude the other, but I'm still a little bit unclear about ultimately it's a very legislative pointed question, but what is a committee and what is an engagement initiative is still the crux of the matter, in my opinion.
Thank you for that. Councillor Demora.
Yeah, I apologize to everyone for the extra airtime that I'm taking up today. And it is because I've been passionate about this process. And, I'm looking forward to some type of new structure. And I think it could be really helpful for the community. The main thing that I think I want to maybe forward to administration is maybe gather some of the nuance that was discussed today and go ahead with, the proposed direction. And I think that it's important to understand that maybe we could down the road incorporate some of our, public engagement within the public engagement policy, which I've, on from time to time said that that needs updating, specifically with reference from the MGA. So there could be an alliance or some type of connection there to kind of reestablish that and have some connectivity to what we're discussing today. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Mayor Arlen, go ahead.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Journeau. I am about ready to make the motion, but before I do, I want to ask through you to Ms. Nadon and Mr. Given, whether the direction ought to be to draft a community conversation policy, or should that include policy and procedures? It seems to me that the devil is going to be in the detail, and we might get a policy and then be back where we are again today. So I see your hand, Mr. Given. So if you could just address your mind to the procedures and when we will get to those, because I think that will be the crux of all of this. The policy, in a broad sense, we could almost conceive today, but it's the process that's going to be difficult.
Deputy Mayor, Thanks, Deputy Mayor Jeannot. So to Mayor Ireland, I think one thing that council may observe is the last few policies that have come through during my time and actually preceding that have been more detailed in the policy level. There are a number of municipal policies that are probably somewhat dated that are simply a sentence, a statement of intent. And I believe best practice is to have more detail contained in the policy. So council is actually in control of approving more detail. So we would expect to bring you something that has a greater level of detail than just simply a policy statement. And my recommendation would be that the procedure should follow that, because council's policy statement direction will influence the administrative procedures that need to happen. And so I would not want to start crafting administrative procedures, assuming that council goes a certain direction. But you can expect to see if committee approves the recommendation, you can expect to see a policy that has a fairly significant level of detail that should be enough to give council the comfort and confidence that they are really directing what's going to be happening, and that the procedures behind it are really truly administrative rather than structural items that would influence the functioning of the and have the risk of altering the intent. So we will bring you a fully fleshed out policy that gives council a significant amount of control. And the administrative procedures, I'm very comfortable, would be a true administrative matter that would follow council's policy direction.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. And it's not so much the control I'm looking for, but the understanding and understanding how this might roll out. But I very much appreciate that response, Mr. Given. And so on that basis, I am prepared to make the motion that committee direct administration to draft a community conversations policy and present at a future committee of the whole meeting.
Thank you for that. Prior to taking a vote on that, Councillor Butler has his hand up for a comment.
Thank you very much. And thank you, Mayor Ireland, for proffering the motion. One thing that has occurred to me is that we do need something to call the process. So a community conversations policy is a good place to start. However, a thought that I've had is that we've all, I think, agreed that the community conversation process, such as it exists now, suffers from being maybe a little less defined than we might hope. It's a little bit squishy. And I have the impression that one of the things about it that's a little bit squishy is the name. So maybe in drafting a community conversations policy, one of the things we will discover is that it might not end up being a community conversations policy. Maybe it's going to be a advisory panel policy, for example. That's one thing that I've seen the provincial government do a few times, for example, or maybe federal government as well. They appoint a panel to discuss an issue or a range of issues and provide advice that would be a little more formalized. So I would suggest that we not get too encumbered or stuck on the idea that it is a community conversation. That's what it's called now, but that suffers from the implication that, well, all they do is get together and talk. And part of the problem is that, as we've stated, that we're not seeing structured outcome from that. So the name itself is part of what we discuss. By the way, I don't think that that's all that community conversations do. I think they come up with really good ideas and suggestions. My concern is that we're not always hearing them, and that's why we can do better. So, thanks.
Thank you, Councillor Butler. I think, yes, we are in the early stages of this. This is one of the concerns that I had, is that community conversation may appear to be more of a drop-in as opposed to formal attendance. And before we continue, or before we move away from this, I'd like some feedback from Ms. Riddell, whom I thank for their contribution for the report, by the way, because she's been doing community conversation for quite some time, and my concern there would be the attendance, or at least attendance of a core group. Any comments in that? Ms. Riddell, thank you.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor Journeau, and through to all of council. Really valid perspectives. Thanks for sharing your comments. I can only offer a couple things here. So currently there's 57 members. We have an average of kind of 7 to 10 people who attend each conversation. And each year we ask attendees just a little bit of background on why they attend, to just better understand the goals of the members and to try and kind of cater the process to the community. 73% of people attend to feel more connected to the community, 77% to learn about what other organizations are doing and opportunities to collaborate. Similar numbers across, 75% to connect with others and 71% to help spread the word about different things happening and help with promotions. So really in general, just the reasons for people for why they attend, and in general, kind of what that attendance is. Thanks.
Thank you for that. Councillor Demora.
Yeah, you know, I like the concept that Councillor Butler had presented, and, you know, whether it's panel, task force, or working group, I think, you know, just like the community conversations with its 57 members, if we have smaller tasks for working groups for each area, I think that, you know, that group could work together with feedback from the broader community, like the structure already has been developed, and I think there could be a really healthy outcome from that. So again, looking forward to it, and I appreciate the motion being on the table. Thank you.
Thank you. I think we'd like to move on. We have a motion before us. It was presented by Mayor Ireland. All clear on the question, the motion? Show of hand, all in favor? There, everybody's in favor, none opposed. I thank you for that. Any final comments before we move on? Thank you. Next item is policy development and review, item 8.2 on the agenda. This was again prepared by Ms. Nadon and Ms. Riddell and being presented by Mr. Given. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor Journeau. I won't be presenting. I will just provide the contextual sort of introduction. Ms. Nadon and the Legislative Services team worked up this report, obviously ably supported by Ms. Byrne. And so Council had asked for administration to present an opportunity to engage in regular review of Council policies. Ms. Nadon undertook a review of our existing policies to see what systems we have set up, and she has some findings in the report here and some very specific recommendations for a policy that administration is recommending Council could adopt. The next steps following that policy adoption would be to initiate the review process and for Council through committee today to identify their priority areas. And basically the question is, if you like this recommendation for policy for reviewing policies, where should we start? And we could start alphabetically, we could start by date age, we could start by subject matter area, and that is the second part of the recommendation, where there is some space for Council to identify your first priority areas for review under the assumption that Council is supportive of the policy as drafted. So I'll turn it over to Ms. Nadon to go over the details of the recommended revisions to policy A001.
Thank you, Mr. Given. So as Mr. Given outlined, the recommendation before council today is that committee recommend council approve the attached policy. We have, since the last committee of the whole meeting, integrated a few edits as requested, and those are highlighted in yellow in the policy. And essentially what it suggests is that we establish a 4-year cycle for review of policies, which would work by approval date once the process is started. But as outlined by Mr. Given, there is a bit of a backlog of policies that are older than 4 years old. And also, so to accompany that or to support that process, a list of priorities to help us navigate the first steps and provide council with an update on where we're at, how progress is going on certain policies that might take longer than others to to update. So similarly to the motion action list, would provide council a at a glance idea of what's happening with those reviews. And yeah, so the policy aspect itself is one, so it being recommended to council for approval is what we're recommending. And then as Mr. Given outlined as well, what are those priorities that we should turn our eye to more immediately than others is the second part of the recommendation. This was brought forward at the last committee of the whole meeting, but we had, I think, 4 councillors in attendance. And there was a will from the councillors present to ensure that there was a good discussion and a broader discussion about this item. So that's why we're back here today with substantially the same report, but with a few edits as requested at the last committee of the whole. Thank you.
Thank you. Before taking questions, I'd like to acknowledge, I made a mistake here earlier, acknowledge and thank Ms. Burns for her contribution to this document. Questions, comments from council? Councillor Butler.
A couple of points. First off, thank you very much for the changes. Well, for all of the work on this and specifically for the changes made. I have read through this closely and I think that you successfully captured all the various comments that were made last time. I'm satisfied with this as it reads now. I'm interested to hear the perspective of others present, of course, on that. Second point I want to make is that this really came to us as a result of a conversation around concerns that I raised, maybe not alone, around fiscal and financial controls. And we took the approach that we acknowledge that numbers of our policies are out of date and need to be addressed. And this was a good starting point. So I appreciate that. And I would suggest that a very early, or I would suggest the first policy that we address should be the fiscal and financial control policy. So I would like to make that suggestion with respect to the requested direction today. But thank you for the work on this. I'm happy with the policy draft as issued and would be happy to make a motion to approve it.
Thank you, Councillor Butler. Any other comments? I would invite input or comment. Oh, thank you. Go ahead, Ms. Mayor Ireland.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Chernow, and regrettably, I missed a meeting when this was initially discussed, so I apologize for taking perhaps a step backwards. Firstly, I want to acknowledge the change in name. I think that's really important, that it becomes the Policy Development and Review Policy. That's a very important point. And to that point, I might suggest that the policy be slightly amended. There is a list of responsibilities in the policy itself, but what I think is lacking, the way I read it at least, is the responsibility to ensure that policies are in fact reviewed on the schedule that we've set out. So I would propose under number 4 of the policy, the Legislative Services Department will, and there's a long list of things that they will do, but a specific reference to the fact that that is the department that will ensure that matters come back to council for review on the 4-year schedule. And maybe it's implicit in there, but if it's left to council, it may not happen. If it is specifically identified as a responsibility to get it to council, then if it falls, it's council's fault. But I just wanted some additional clarity there. I'll go through my 3 points if I could, Deputy Mayor. I see that Mr. Given wanted to respond, but if I throw them all out, it might be easier. The other point is in number 3. The third bullet point, and this is department directors and managers, they'll conduct research on the policy issue, including initial consultation with affected groups. Well, that seems to me to be perhaps an impossibility in some cases, certainly in a policy as general as this. Is there an affected group? If we're talking about, as we just did, a policy to convert committees to a community conversation format, how can a director be expected to consult with affected groups? It could be anyone and everyone in the community. So I think that is a challenge that might be worded down a little bit. I think that's far too onerous, even if it was conduct research as necessary or something, just to soften it a bit, because in some cases I think that'll be impractical. And finally, the definition, and I don't know how much time you spent on this, but I struggled with the definition of policies because I don't think that a policy statement sets discretionary duties. I think once we have a policy, it sets a standard, and the standard has to be maintained. What is discretionary is the setting of the standard. So it seems to me that a policy is more a discretionary council statement that sets direction, duties, and standards of performance, which is a slight difference in wording. But council has the discretion to have a policy or not. But once it has a policy, performance of the policy shouldn't be discretionary. It should be expected. So those are the three comments that I have. And with that, I will leave it open, and perhaps these were discussed at an earlier time. But thank you for that opportunity, Deputy Mayor.
Thank you for Mayor Ireland for your specificity in wording, precise wording, and very appropriate in this case, in my mind. Thank you for that. More questions, comments? I think Mr. Given had his hand up for the first point. Go ahead.
Yes, thanks very much, Deputy Mayor Journeau. And to Mayor Ireland's points, I think administration can incorporate those recommendations. And so if committee wish to generally accept those and ask administration to do a new draft, a motion could be to to recommend that council approve the policy as amended, and we would bring forward the amended version to the council meeting. Specifically to Mayor Ireland's points, I would suggest, council, that we might want to consider the responsibility to ensure the regular review of policies in accordance with this policy be a responsibility of the CAO. I think that is ultimately something that you task your chief administrative officer with. I mean, ultimately, of course, yes, it will be the legislative services department and the directors that will provide the horsepower there, but I think the ultimate responsibility lies with the CAO. And so I think it's a fair point to specifically identify that. I would suggest it should be under CAO. Appreciate the suggestion of essentially striking, including the initial consultation with affected groups. I think that that's likely to happen, but appreciate that it is, it might be over a higher level of detail than is necessary at that stage. And then finally, I think Mayor Ireland is exactly right in the definition of policies. Municipal policies are, by definition, discretionary in that they're not required, most are not required under legislation. And so, it is a bit of a nuance. We could potentially revise that definition to provide a sentence that contrasts them with required legislative processes. So the nuance that the mayor is raising, I think, is understood, and it's something administration could propose a revision before bringing the amended version to council next week.
Thank you. Comments? Councillor Butler.
Thanks very much. Just picking up on the word discretionary in definitions. I read that as being a recognition that there are duties and standards of performance that are not discretionary on the part of administration. For example, there is human rights legislation and administration is bound to conform to human rights legislation, however, the municipality may set a policy which overlays that with respect to some higher level of expectation. So I thought that was the intent there, but I agree that as written, it's perhaps a little unclear and could be touched up, and I'm certainly confident that administration can do so. But that's, I don't know if that was the intent. That's how I read it, recognizing that there are lots of things administration does which aren't stated in policy, but are in fact non-discretionary because they're stated elsewhere in legislation. So that's how I read it.
Thank you. Do we have any comments? I know it's early again in the development of this, but under recommendations in the second point, there is a secondary bullet to suggest or recommend a policy that to be determined by council that may want to be reviewed. Does council have any comments on that, or any wish, or on the wish list maybe? Councillor Keller MP.
I believe our municipal bylaw policy needs to be updated because we now have CAO1, CAO2s, and municipal officers, and I know that has not been updated for a number. And I know council has to make a decision on which way we go towards the end of this year. So I think that one needs to be at the forefront.
Thank you for that. Duly noted by administration. Any other? Councillor Butler, go ahead.
Well, I'm not sure if my point landed, but I feel strongly that we need to address the fiscal and financial control policy as a first order of business.
Thank you for that. Again, noted by administration. Thank you. Mr. Given.
Yeah, thanks very much, Deputy Mayor Journeau. What I would say, rather than noted by administration, would be that first, if council wishes to deal with the policy, we would request a specific motion that council says these are the things specifically that we want to have addressed. That way it isn't, that is 100% clear that there is a council endorsement of the priorities that you're choosing. So first is dealing with the first bullet point under recommendations, recommending forward policy A001 as amended to council, and then we could deal with identifying the priorities with a separate motion following that first one.
Okay, we're all clear on that. So can I have a motion, Mayor Ireland firstly, and then Councillor Butler secondly.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Journeau. I just want to confirm, and I didn't do this myself, and I regret that, but the fiscal control policies that have been referenced by Councillor Butler, are those all in Section B, Business Administration, or are they contained in various things, including municipal services and municipal governance? I'm just wondering if it's possible to give a direction that says the first priority will be those policies that fall under Section B, Business Administration, or do we have to be more general than that and just say financial controls?
Mr. Given.
Your worship, through Deputy Mayor Journeau, I would say that administration is comfortable with whatever approach. Council could identify a thematic area, council could identify a section, or council could identify a specific policy. And again, recognizing that this will be a separate question, because we are suggesting that these are two different motions. One is to send something to council, and one is to send something back to us with your council's priorities. But what I thought I heard Councillor Butler say was specifically the fiscal and financial controls policy, which is B009. So that's what I believe, that's how I interpreted it. And if there was a different intent, maybe we could clarify that. It could be council identifying B009, C018, and it could be that specific, or it could be around a thematic area of saying all fiscal policies. But again, many of the policies have a fiscal implication, and so it might be helpful to be a bit more specific. Knowing that, this is really just identifying where the start is, because the policy itself, as a reminder, is setting the stage for council to regularly engage in all policies. And another item I'd note is Councillor Demota has talked even in this meeting about the community engagement policy and bylaw. And so that may be an area that would come up as well. But council can be as specific or as general in helping administration determine what the starting point is if council decides that they want to pass the policy in the first place.
So we are in committee, so all we can do is recommend to council. So where do we go from here? Please help me. Councillor Butler.
I'm responding to Mayor Ireland's question about what I was referring to. And I had thought of that quite a lot. So are we talking about reviewing policies, policies that have an impact on fiscal and financial controls, or are we talking about policy B009 fiscal and financial control policy? And I think the answer, because life is never simple, is both. So I would suggest that we review policy B009 fiscal and financial control policies, but there are many cases where our policies interconnect, and an example here would be policy B007 is staff and council expenses administrative, or staff and council expenses policy, which certainly has an impact on fiscal and financial control policy. So I thought, to keep it simple, we should start with the fiscal and financial control policy, but we should recognize that anytime we mess with a policy, we are likely to discover that we may have to address other policies concurrently, and should do so. So administration shouldn't feel hampered to limit its concern to only a policy that council has directed it to look at, but also to point out where there are overlaps between policies that would have to be addressed. That would be my comment on that.
Thank you, Councillor Butler. Mr. Given, please.
Sure, Deputy Mayor Jeannot, one comment on process, and then just one on administrative perspective. The first on process, again, if council could, if there was a motion that dealt with the policy itself and gave us clarity on whether we're moving that forward to council or back to administration for more work, that would be helpful. The administrative perspective, when we get to the discussion on setting priorities, there is a consideration around workload balance. And so when we start to talk about that, that would be an administrative perspective that I would share, is that if council said we want all financial control policies to be reviewed, as the first thing, I might say to you that that could be challenging, considering our finance department is going to be very soon starting in budget development. And so we may just want to make sure there's an appropriate balance of workload, rather than identifying policies that would exclusively implicate or majority implicate one department when it gets to that. And that's why sort of picking the start is where we're asking council to engage here. We're happy to do that. And then from there, it would become a matter of administrative procedure of regularly recommending and bringing things forward on the cycle that is recommended in the policy.
Thank you for that. We do have two recommendations, so can we? Sorry, Councillor Butler, before I finish my comments, go ahead.
Well, I think you were asking for a motion, and I'm prepared to make the first motion. So I'll move that committee recommend council approve policy A-001 policy development and review with amendments. Period.
With amendment, are we clear on what is meant by that?
I think administration has taken the comments made today and will bring back the policy with some amendments to address those concerns, and then we will look at it and act accordingly, pass it or further amend it.
Thank you for the motion, Councillor Butler. Debate? I think we all clear on, there'll be a second motion on the recommendation. So can we vote on this motion? Show of hands, all in favor? All are supporting, so that is carried. Thank you very much. Now we have another recommendation, the committee direct administration to establish a review priority list. So can I have a motion? Mr. Given, is that appropriate now, or are we in the discussion? Yes, can I have a motion to for that recommendation, please? Thank you, Councillor Butler.
So I will make a motion that committee direct administration to establish a policy review priority list to guide the review cycle, and that the following be the first priorities. That has an S bullet point. First would be policy D009, fiscal and financial control policy. And within reason, respecting workload of administration, I would consider this an opportunity for councillors to add bullet items as friendly amendment. And then we should end up with a motion that we agree on today.
Thank you for that motion, Councillor Butler.
That wasn't clear. I could say it again.
That's your opening remarks on the motion. Thank you. Any further comments from councillors or any questions on this subject? Will there be a need to close debate on this, Councillor Butler? Okay, Mayor Ireland, thank you.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. It is a challenge. I am quite prepared to support the motion that we start with a review of B009. And then we can add over time. There seems to be some difficulty right now to completing the list, but I just want to be clear that this motion establishes priorities with respect to policy review, but as I read it, wouldn't impact the ongoing policy development. That is, although I see the need to review that financial controls policy, I don't want that to supplant the ongoing effort to develop a policy, say, based on the community conversations model that we just discussed. So as long as it is understood that the two things can happen together, that is ongoing policy development, but policy review on this priority. So accept the financial controls policy as the first, and we can add to that later, because otherwise I think we'll be here for a long time today trying to sort out a priority list.
Yes, I think the idea was just to have a suggestion or at least one. So I think we've moved in the right direction there. Thank you for that. Councillor Kelleher-Ampey.
I don't have the policy number, but I'd like the policy on municipal bylaw to be looked at, because it has come to this council where we have to make a decision going forward, whether we go, say, at municipal bylaw or CAO2. And I believe our policy is not up to date. I think it just states municipal officers and not even CAO ones.
So the list is now doubled in the early stages. Thank you for that. Mr. Given.
Yeah, thank you, Deputy Mayor Journeau. Just respecting what Councillor Kelleher-Ampey identified here, administration is aware of the issue around the designation of our CPOs and our bylaw enforcement department. We are looking at that issue and plan to bring it forward in the near term. Ms. Nadon pointed out to me that it is actually not a policy, though. It is not by definition a policy matter. It is contained in a bylaw, that designation. So we are planning on bringing that forward to council. We don't need specific direction to do so. It's possible that out of that discussion may come a recommendation to develop a policy, but there isn't currently a policy to review that affects that issue. So just to be clear, we hear you, Councillor Kelleher-Ampey. We are aware of that issue and we plan on bringing it forward in relatively short order, but it isn't explicitly a policy, so it wouldn't be a part of the policy review per se.
Thank you. I believe Councillor Demota has some comments.
Yeah, just to clarify, you know, so I don't need to bring it up, but I'm bringing it up. Through you, Deputy Mayor Journeau, to Mr. Given, you did discuss having public engagement in there.
I did note that that is an issue that council has discussed in public meetings on a regular basis.
Okay. Because I think I was going to even recommend establishing a policy redundancy policy. So in case we ever had any of those that became redundant, we could just crumple it up and throw it in a trash bin somewhere and not have to worry about it anymore. Anyway, that was just for levity's sake.
Thank you. Yes, it's because it was not part of the recommendation for sure. Councillor Butler, your motion. You want to close debate? Can we move on? You've all heard the motion. Can I have a show of hands?
That the motions, if I understand discussions here, the motion stands as I stated. Committee direct administration to establish a policy review priority list to guide the review cycle, and that the following be the first priority: policy B009, fiscal and financial control policy.
Thank you for that.
Oh, and my understanding is that Councillor Keller MD point, which I think is a very valid one, actually references a bylaw and not a policy, so therefore would be part of a different discussion.
Acknowledged. So thank you for that. All clear? Show of hands. All in favor? Everybody is supporting. There are none opposed. Thank you for that. Next item. Under new business, item 8.3, principles for utility rates bylaw.
Yes, Deputy Mayor Journeau, if I may, I'll be handling this report. I'll just say that it is a fairly comprehensive report that is likely to elicit some discussion. Certainly, I know the presentation will be a little bit lengthy to start off with, and it might be an appropriate time if council feels it would be the right time to do so, to take a little bit of a break before we launch into it, because I imagine that we'll go for some time on this report. So just give that to you for consideration for the chair.
Thank you for that suggestion. It is 10:49. How about 10:55? 6 minutes. Thank you. We will return at 10:50. I'll give you an extra one, 56. Thank you. Thank you. We are addressing item 8.3, principles for utility rates bylaw, and that is being prepared and presented by our CAO, Mr. Given. Go ahead.
Yes, thank you very much, Deputy Mayor Journeau and Council. This report arises out of a discussion at a Council Strategic Priorities session earlier in the year. As Council knows, there have been discussions at the Council table for a number of years considering changes to the water and sewer rates model to more equitably distribute the cost of providing services between users. And council saw that as a strategic priority for this term to ensure that the good work of this council and administration that has happened prior to 2021 wasn't lost, and that this issue was considered and dealt with before the conclusion of the term. I'll start with just reviewing the recommendations to describe what administration is recommending at a high level, and then I'll go into the details and background. The first recommendation is that committee recommend council approve the utility rates model with the following component charges: the base system access, the tiered consumption and infrastructure replacement, and that committee direct administration to present a multi-year recommendation for utility rates based on the rate model at the 2022 budget presentation. So to be clear, today administration is presenting a concept of a model that would set out a fee structure based on these three different categories, but we are not recommending that council change the rates for the 2021 year. We are recommending that if council likes the model, that you should give us direction to develop the 2022 rate recommendation in alignment with the model. So it would essentially ensure that this council develops the model and that the next council would receive a recommendation from administration on what the rates should be based on the model that this council develops. We have included alternatives that could, if council wished, direct administration to present a multi-year recommendation for utility rates for implementation in the 2021 calendar year, if council wished, or to not consider any additional changes to the utility rate model at this time. So just to be clear, the intent of administration's recommendation is to see if there is council concurrence with the model. And then our recommendation would be that if council is willing to approve the model, that the rates for 2022 and beyond would be established in accordance with that model and approved by council following the municipal election. So just to be clear what administration is recommending and what we're not recommending, I thought I'd highlight that. But essentially, as you can see, the report contains a significant amount of background. I know that this council has been particularly concerned and prioritized asset management. And so a seminal report in that area is the 2017 Asset Management Study, which identified that overall the municipality should be reinvesting approximately $7 million a year into our capital infrastructure on an ongoing basis to maintain the long-term stability of those capital assets of all types, facilities, and utilities, and not just utilities alone. Specifically to the water and wastewater systems, that 2017 report recommended that the ongoing annual contribution in terms of reinvestment in capital infrastructure for water and wastewater systems should be about $1.67 million. And you can see that the table there demonstrates what the actual capital investments in water and wastewater have been since that report. And I would suggest that this is not a issue that has occurred just this term. I think that this is a long-standing issue, recognizing that much of the municipal infrastructure in the municipality is relatively new, given the fact that the municipality is relatively new. The water wastewater treatment plant received a significant upgrade and investment with that new infrastructure in the early 2000s. And there was not at that time, or could easily have been understood at that time, that the municipality had other priorities and that the wastewater treatment plant was quite new. That said, there are pipes in the ground that are over 80 years old throughout the community, as council will be well aware. And so I think that this investment level in maintaining the utilities infrastructure is two different parts, both of which sort of reflect the relative newness of the municipality. We're approaching just 20 years old, and many of the assets were previously the responsibility of other parties. Those old assets were turned over to us, and the municipality was focused on building and operating the new wastewater treatment plant. I think what the 2017 report identified is that after a certain period of time, there needs to be an ongoing level of regular reinvestment. So I wouldn't position this or suggest that this is a problem of this council term. I think it is a systemic problem that has reasons that predate this council. But the fact is that that 2017 report recommended a certain amount of capital investment on an annual basis, and the actuals from 2018 to date are what they are as reflected in the report. That aside, and really only as background, administration is proposing a utility rate model that incorporates 3 distinct charges covering specific components: a base system access charge, tiered consumption rates, and an infrastructure replacement charge. I'll discuss each of the 3 in order. I'm happy to take questions as I go through at any point. And so, Deputy Mayor Journeau, if I do see a council member raise their hand, I'll pause so that you can recognize them, or I'll maybe note that somebody had a question and I'll pause. I'm happy to take questions as I go. Or if people want to save their questions to the end, that's also okay with me. But Deputy Mayor Journeau, if that sounds okay to you as chair, that's the way that I'd proceed.
It's fine by me. Councillor Demota has a comment already.
Yeah, I was just wondering, like on these recommendations that are coming forward with the different structures, have we taken these models from other communities? Like, how has this process come about? I'm just curious.
Yes, thanks, Deputy Mayor Journeau, through to Councillor Demota. Yes, administration has taken these recommendations, has built these recommendations on best practice in the utilities world, and well, you know, the Bible of utility rate model setting, as well as examples from other municipalities and other utility providers, not exclusively in water and wastewater, but utilities generally, whether they're water, wastewater, telephone systems or electrical systems. There is a component of consumption, of using a something, whether that's water or electricity or natural gas. And there is a relationship between the consumption of that service that and the infrastructure that is required to provide and deliver that good, that consumable item. And so and I'll describe that as we go through, where you see things like a base system access fee and infrastructure fees and others. I'll just try to relate those to other utilities as it becomes relevant.
So, Mr. Given, I think you can proceed. Go ahead.
Okay, thanks, Deputy Mayor Journeau. So the first item that administration is recommending should be a part of the model would be the base system access charge or fee. We haven't settled on that terminology, but it's the principle is more the point here. This charge would allow the municipality to guarantee the base costs of operating the system that are not particularly tied to consumption. So as council can recognize, in order to run a water utility, there are certain things that are required that do not change or do not significantly change based on how much of the water is consumed. So for example, the municipality needs to maintain computer systems and program systems required to send out bills. And whether, you know, in the unlikely event that nobody in Jasper consumed any water, we would still need to have that computer system in place. So there are certain things like the billing system and the meter reading system, fire protection system, hydrant inspection, testing and maintenance, sanitary line cleaning and manhole inspection, water meter repair and inspection, and storm line cleaning that need to happen on an ongoing basis to ensure the ongoing operation of the system. And there are also staffing costs that we are required to have in order to have a system in the first place. And very few of those staffing costs change based on the amount of water consumed. So for example, we need to have a position of a utilities manager. And so whether you turn on your taps at home or not, the municipality still needs to have a staffing position of utilities manager. These are the base costs of operating the system. And having a base system access charge or fee would ensure that all properties connected to the system contribute to the core costs that are required to operate the system in the first place. So I'll pause there for a brief second to see if there are any thoughts or questions around the idea of a base system access charge or fee.
Thanks for your explanation in this. Mr. Given, I was a bit unclear what it meant at first, but I certainly acknowledge the approach that needs to happen for an effective billing system. Any questions, comments? Councillor Butler.
Thanks very much. I certainly understand the principle of using a base system access fee, and I agree with it. But my comment would be that the items listed, those 6 or 7 bullet points, don't represent really at all the cost of the base system. The base system itself is not addressed through readings and cleaning lines and repair and inspection. The cost of the base system is the cost of the in-ground infrastructure. And I think when we talk about 6 system access, we have to recognize that every single connection in the community is essential, and everyone needs to pay their share of the basic cost of that infrastructure. So while I agree with the base system access concept, the recommendation would seem to assign a really relatively very small portion of the overall cost of the system to that billing line. And I think we need to examine that. For example, when I look at my electrical billings, the system access fee, what I have to pay to have electricity delivered to my residence, even if I manage to live for a month without drawing a single watt of power, is very high in recognition of the fact that the cost of the system benefits everyone, every user, and everyone has to pay. And so I agree with the principle, but I think that we should be probably addressing a considerably higher portion of the overall cost of the system to that billing mode.
Deputy Mayor Journeau, if I may, Councillor Butler, you've really hit on it. And administration's recommendation is that that cost of the infrastructure is in the infrastructure replacement charge, and so we'll discuss that as the third component. And I guess at a higher level for all council members, the discussion that administration is hoping to have today is, are these the right 3 components? The next discussion that would relate to setting rates would be, in what degree do we apply these components? What is the weighting between these 3? If we know that all 3 need to add up to 100%, what percent, we need a total amount, 100%. Well, we could have it so that 70% is gathered through the base system access charge, and the remaining 30% is split 15 on consumption and 15 on infrastructure replacement. Or we could have it that it is set, 50% on infrastructure replacement, and then the other 50% is split between. So, and that is not the discussion that we want to have today, because there is complexity to that, and there are policy choices to be made when you assign those costs. So what we are hoping to present today is really the discussion about the 3 buckets. Are these the right 3 buckets, and does this logic make sense? If council believes that the logic makes sense, then the direction to administration is come back with a recommendation on rates using this logic, and then council will engage in the policy discussion about to what degree you pull each of those 3 levers. So we certainly will talk about infrastructure. It is a significant part of the model, and it is the last one after tiered consumption.
Councillor Demota would like to address the meeting.
Yeah, and I appreciate Mr. Given bringing that up. And I think that personally, and it might not be the general view of council, but I believe that we should probably partake in a public engagement process when it comes to finalizing this. I like the presentation there, and to what degree, and are these the 3 right things? And I think if it's going to have a long-term impact on the community and the users, that we should hear or have, or give the ability for those that may be largely affected an opportunity to discuss this at a deeper level, so that council, we're made up of 7 people that represent the community in different aspects and stuff, but I think it would be a healthy process. And reason being, because I've been through a few webinars recently and learned that the County of Leduc struggled in many different ways, and they went out and did that type of process and came up with a really good final product. And with the community engagement, it was well received by the stakeholders. So that would be my recommendation down the road. But I look forward to hearing the other 2 parts of the presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Butler. Any other comments? We'll allow Mr. Given to proceed.
Thanks very much, Deputy Mayor Journeau. So the second component of the recommended model is consumption rates, and specifically administration is recommending tiered consumption rates. I know the council has had a bit of a discussion about that. To be clear, at this stage, we are not recommending what those tiers look like or how they're structured. I think Councillor DeMotte has hit on something. There are policy choices there that council may want to engage the community on. But at a principal level, administration's view is that there should be some portion of a utility bill that is reflective of how much of the good you consume, because there are costs that are directly related to an increase or decrease in volumes. And so some examples of that would include the wastewater treatment operational contract, the operational costs, such as utilities and energy, goods and supplies, such as chemicals for treating wastewater. All of those things have a correlation, and in many cases, actually direct causality from the increase or decrease in the volumes consumed. So that is the principle around having a consumption portion of the bill, just like you would have on your utility bill. For electricity, you see the amount of kilowatt hours that you've consumed as a distinct item that says, I use this much power and therefore I have this much charge. What we're proposing here is I use this much water and put out this much wastewater, therefore I have this much charge. Additionally, administration is recommending that council support a tiered approach that would see the cost of that good, water, increase along with consumption. And the reason that administration is recommending this is because we have reflected on council's strategic priorities and council's specific desire to allocate expenses equitably between taxpayers, service users, and visitors, and to pursue equitable allocation of costs. And we see that theme reflected in council's strategic priorities. And our recommendation is that a tiered approach to consumption is most directly in alignment with council's focus on equitably allocating expenses. For example, a tiered approach that is focused on a tiered approach to consumption charges would ensure that a residential property with a PHA that consumed a high volume of water could fall into a different rate category than a commercial property that consumes a small amount of water. So in some communities, you may have a commercial rate for water and you may have a residential rate for water. Well, what happens when a residential property consumes more water than a commercial business? So the administration's recommendation here is that the most equitable approach is to say that your rate is tied to the amount of water that you consume. And if you consume more water, you begin to pay at a higher rate. The policy question for council will be, and this may be something that council would wish to engage with the community on, would be to what degree does that rate increase along with consumption? And then I would acknowledge that that is an important question. It is not the question that we're suggesting we solve today. We are suggesting that there's a principle here that says an equitable way to handle consumption charges is to say that if you use more, you may pay more because your increased usage leads to increased expense for the municipality. This is not a service where there are economies of scale per se, particularly on the consumption section of the bill. If users consume more water, we consume more electricity at the wastewater treatment plant to process the effluent. We also consume more in goods, and there is more wear and tear on the system that leads to more maintenance. And so there is a direct connection between increased consumption and increased expense to the system. And that's why administration is recommending a tiered approach. And we would, in our further recommendations, when we would bring this forward, you would see that it is tied to the consumption rather than tied to the class of property. Again, that's something that council could consider. We are not being specific about that, but conceptually, if a high volume water user is a residential property, then perhaps it is equitable that they pay at a higher rate than a low consumption commercial property, rather than what happens in our taxation system, where commercial properties pay more just because they are commercial properties. And so administration is suggesting that a equitable approach is to really reflect the cost of the consumption without regard for the class of consumer. So that is the tiered consumption portion of the rate model. I'll pause there to see if there are any questions or discussion.
Questions, discussions? I'll have a comment. It's on the tiered consumption. For example, commercial properties. Would we be taking into factor that some units have older, properties have older units, whereby in refrigeration, for example, the water is not reused, it's simply disposed of, so that the cost of water now becomes an incentive for them to update their equipment to newer, greener type of equipment? Thank you.
Yes, Deputy Mayor Journeau, that isn't the primary reason for administration's recommendation about tiered consumption charges, but it is an associated benefit. Anytime we as human beings or businesses are charged more for something, we probably try to use less of it. There's sort of a natural cause and effect there. And so Council in your strategic priorities had identified that you wish to, where appropriate, improve the equitable distribution of municipal service costs and ease the tax burden through implementing user fees, specifically environmental service fees. This could be seen to be an environmental service fee, that there is a relationship between encouraging more conscious use and consumption of the product, the water, and certainly a tiered fee that went in alignment with increased consumption would encourage people to do what they could to reduce their consumption, when that may mean new technology or different processes to consume less water.
Thank you. Questions, comments? Councillor Butler.
Thank you very much. This, of course, is where we really came to a really fraught and difficult discussion last fall. I think I could say that in principle, there was consensus among council. I don't want to try to speak for councillors, but in principle, consumption-based and tiering could be a fair and effective model for billing, but the devil is in the details. And so the question that may be implicit, but I think it should be explicit here, is what a, in quotes, user or a unit, how that is defined. And I'll use an example. So tiering could mean, if I own a 4-unit apartment building with one connection and one meter, I will, as the owner of that building, be responsible for a certain amount of consumption, and I may accept that that consumption would be scaled. And so the more water is used, I would pay disproportionately more for my 4-unit apartment building. Now, what about someone who owns a 40-unit apartment building using presumably 10 times more water because there are 40 units? Does that user pay 10 times more because that building uses 10 times more water? Or does that user pay disproportionately more because he is using 10 times more water? What's fair? There are 4 families in the one building using 4-unit amounts of water. The other one has 40 family using 40 units of water. The model that we saw last fall would have suggested that the 40-unit apartment is billed at a higher, disproportionately higher rate for the higher amounts of water consumed, but it's 40 users, not really one user. So we really have to think about what that would look like. And I could draw the same example for a 10-unit hotel versus a 100-unit hotel. What's fair? Do we penalize the 100-unit hotel just because he's big? Or should the tiering be applied on some sort of per unit notional basis? And we really came apart on that issue last fall, and I think it's worth highlighting. My second piece around consumption-based billing, and I am in favor of consumption-based billing as a principle, is that we've been trundling along fairly successfully, basing all of our wastewater treatment fee collection on water consumption. Fair enough. It's really hard to measure sewage, and it's really easy to measure water consumption. But we're talking about a system that now we're proposing where we will need to collect about 4.5 times more utility payments than what we've been collecting traditionally. So the community's tolerance for that kind of system may change. So one question we have to ask ourselves is it fair to collect the bulk of wastewater treatment plant fees based on water consumption? Or should we be thinking about allowing some discretion or exemption or something where users use quite a lot of water, for example, for landscaping purposes, where that water is not flowing into the system? And again, we haven't seen a tremendous amount of pushback, but if we raise the fees a lot more, I think we may, and we're going to have to think about that. So there's two areas that I think are worthy of being noted as being part of this discussion in this section.
Thank you for injecting that into the conversation. Your numbers of 4.5 times are a little daunting. Mr. Given, you had you're ready.
Deputy Mayor Journeau, I just wanted to thank Councillor Butler. Those are useful examples, the 4-unit residential development with 1 service line and 1 bill, and a 40-unit residential development with 1 service line and 1 bill. And those absolutely are important questions that we would need to be considerate of. And to be clear at this stage, first, I need to make that point that administration isn't suggesting that of the 100% of your total bill, that consumption charges necessarily make up a significant, I mean, it could be that consumption charges are only 20% of your bill, for example. And so the relative degree to which the tiers increase actually might not make a major dent in your bill one way or another. And we see that today in, and disappointingly so, I think, for a lot of people, in electricity. You know, there are many times of the year where your consumption is very low, or natural gas, your consumption is very low, and yet your bill seems, at least to me, sometimes quite high. And it feels like you don't have that much control. But that is an example of how, in that system, the majority of the charges are actually not on your consumption. They are coming from other things. And so that is a discussion the council will need to have. It is an important policy discussion. And to be clear, administration isn't quite at the stage to make a recommendation on that yet. But you give some useful examples that we can consider when and if we bring forward rates based on this model. So I want to thank you for that. I don't know if there are other questions on this section, or if we're ready to move to the infrastructure replacement charge.
Any other comments? We have to be thankful to the electrical companies that first introduced the replacement model many years ago, and have certainly not well understood, not well received for sure then, but I think it's becoming commonplace, and I think it's appropriate for us to move on to that. So any more comments? Go ahead, Mr. Given, on the infrastructure replacement information.
Okay, thank you, Deputy Mayor Journeau. So the final component of the 3 would be the infrastructure replacement charge. The infrastructure replacement charge would be a contribution by the ratepayers towards the capital costs of repair, replacement, and upgrading of the water and wastewater systems. And to ensure that this was a transparent fee, it would be directly related to the multi-year utilities capital plan as approved by council. So council approves a capital plan that identifies a number of capital projects over the next period of time that need to happen. When council approves that plan, it would influence the infrastructure replacement charge. And council could decide, when you're setting the rates, and again about those levers, about how much you choose to pull on which lever, how much of that future infrastructure replacement charge is borne by the general tax base and all taxpayers through the form of paying for infrastructure through municipal taxes, and how much of that future infrastructure replacement and repair is handled by the ratepayers through the infrastructure replacement charge. So let's say, for example, there is a, over the next 10 years, there is a $16 million of infrastructure replacement that needs to happen. Administration presents the details of that and the forecast of that. Council reviews it, questions it, debates it, and ultimately arrives at a approved capital plan, multi-year capital plan. That multi-year capital plan number, administration would work backward and figure out what the infrastructure replacement charge should be to fund that capital plan. Also recognizing that council may say, you need to fund 100% of that capital plan through the infrastructure replacement charge, or you need to fund 70% of that capital plan, or you need to fund 50% or 30%, with the balance being picked up by municipal taxation or grants or other items. But the principle here is that the users of the system contribute towards the cost of maintaining and improving the hard infrastructure that's in the ground, and that there is a transparent and easily understood way for the public and for the ratepayers to see what those costs are, so that they can understand why they're paying that charge. And that is the conclusion of the three sections. I'm happy to have any discussion on the infrastructure replacement charge or all of the three sections. I just note that the report attempted to demonstrate in the table at the end how these three different sections align with council's strategic priorities, and why administration chose to recommend these, because we feel that is in alignment with the direction that council set through your strategic priorities. The next question after this would be, if council likes this approach, then when would you wish administration to develop some proposals for rates based on this approach? Should that be with this council for implementation in this calendar year, or should it be presented to the next council for implementation in the following year for 2022? And I noted at the start that we've included that as an alternative recommendation for you. But in any case, the focus today, I believe, is really on these principles, and if these three components make sense for our utility rate model.
Thank you for that. Councillor Demota has his hand up. Go ahead.
Well, thank you, Deputy Mayor, through you. Well, maybe not to Mr. Given, but I appreciate that he brought that up, that you brought that up, Mr. Given, in the sense that, we're kind of on that bubble. We're using our strategic priorities for this current council and wanting to, go forward and develop something. But essentially, I think what's going to happen, regardless of what we try to implement this year, we're going to have a new council, and we don't know what that's going to be comprised of, or who it's going to be comprised of, and strategic priorities might change, as well as council's desire to establish what we have presented in front of us. So I think ultimately, from my point of view, is that it will have to come as a recommendation from us to the next council, and maybe take on the majority of the work right now, so that when it comes to the new council having to make, heavy decisions for their first budget cycle, that they'll have some preparation for it in advance. But I don't think that we can make a decision this time, but that's just my point of view. Thank you.
Thank you. Heavy decisions as opposed to light decisions. Mayor Harlan.
More informed, let's say.
Well, thank you for that. I certainly would be supportive of council making a decision. I think this is here because we asked, given the work that this council has done on that, on the whole topic, for about a year or perhaps more, that we get to this point and leave something for an incoming council. But my question, Mr. Given, through you, Deputy Mayor Journeau, to Mr. Given, you mentioned that there are 3 proposed buckets. Are there any buckets that you have discarded that we have not considered? Does anybody else add another way, like a 4th or a 5th bucket to any of this?
Deputy Mayor Journeau, to Mayor Ireland's question, there are other approaches that I'd suggest are maybe replaced. Some will base a charge on the size of meter, which I would suggest is a bit of a way to try to reflect consumption. Using, rather than saying just the cubic meters of water consumed, that you have a charge for your meter charge. Sometimes the meter charge will stand in for your base system access charge. And I know in other communities, the cost of new meters, and this is particularly focused on communities where there is significant new growth, the cost of a new meter installation is really reflective of an investment in the hard infrastructure. So there are other terms that people use. I'd suggest that these are the 3 general categories, although they may, people may slide a piece and describe it differently. The other approach that I've seen is really that there's one charge, and all of these things are attempted to be captured under consumption. Administration's advice here for breaking it out between these 3 different charges is that this is the most transparent approach for users to understand the costs associated with the system. The idea of having a base system charge that is explicitly spelled out and able to be described helps users understand that there's a cost to running a utility, no matter what is consumed. The consumption charge, I think, is pretty self-explanatory, and that the infrastructure charge, again, and being tied to a specifically published and knowable list of capital items, helps users understand the costs of maintaining the infrastructure. Other municipalities may have all of those things bundled into one charge, which is less transparent for users of the system and the public. Other municipalities may also subsidize these rates. And so I don't believe that there are additional categories or buckets. I think the opposite is true. What happens more often is municipalities will have fewer buckets and less transparency because they've poured everything into one, and it can be difficult for users of the system and ratepayers to disentangle what portion, where the costs are coming from.
Thank you. I appreciate that. The one that occurs to me, I agree with these 3 buckets. For my simple mind, connection, consumption, and capital replacement. But if it does come, or if we choose to make it come to less than 100%, then another bucket is general tax revenue. And maybe in some respects, that is not inappropriate. And so where I would like this to go, I would support the first of the requested recommendations, that you develop something based on a model that includes these 3 components. But I would prefer the following discussion to look at sort of proportionality between these buckets rather than specifically rates. So I agree with Councillor Butler's early comments that what we have as examples in the connection fee or the base system access does not, to me, cover quite enough. So whatever your consumption rate, we need a water system to have fire hydrants which protect your house. There's a value in that. And it doesn't matter whether you use any water yourself or not. The availability of that system is something which is a benefit to every owner. Now, maybe it would be fair to say, well, that's part of the tax burden, but we could then take that portion out. But I would like to know whether we think sort of generally the apportionment between connection and consumption should be about equal, or should it be 2/3, 1/3? And then we can work on setting rates after we know that. And maybe the capital replacement is a standalone. It is what it is. It's how, again, you apportion that. And is that something that is logically apportioned based on consumption, or again, a component of connection and consumption? So there's still, I think, questions of principle to be addressed before we get down to rates. But I like the direction in which we seem to be headed. And so I would support building something based on these three utility rates making up the model, but then before we get to rates, get to proportionality.
Thanks you for that comment. I have a bit of a clarification on infrastructure replacement. We've not ruled out the fact that we could split it between the utilities and the general taxation. Is this correct? Like it's still open, right? Okay, and I think that that's important to introduce at this time to the public. Let them know that that's what we're proposing and that there's a lot of options, and hopefully we'll get their feedback. Councillor Demota mentioned open house information, which might have value. Councillor Kelleher MP, please.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. To Mr. Givens, so this, that we go with this tier model and then the infrastructure replacement. The funds we collect from the infrastructure replacement will go into a reserve for replacement that's decided by council on the capital assets, or would that be my understanding? And then we wouldn't take that money from the general tax, we would take it from there. Am I correct?
Deputy Mayor Journeau to Councillor Kelleher MP, yes, that's exactly correct. The intent would be for a clear and transparent sort of collection of funds for a commitment to a dedicated purpose, that they would not go into general municipal revenues. They would be set aside into the utilities to fund the utilities capital program as approved by council.
Thank you. Comments, more comments, Councillor Demota. And then Councillor Butler. Sorry.
Yeah, I was going to say, thank you for acknowledging the public engagement idea, and maybe just even take it a little further. That we had a working group that was designed to help our decision in the cannabis process, the bylaw there. And I think that maybe a working group or strategic committee of some sort could be struck to help us wade through this and come back and make recommendations to council, and having those, external town halls or whatever it may be with the community to come back with a proper recommendation, just throwing out ideas there for future consideration.
Thank you. Councillor Butler.
Thanks very much, and thank you, Mr. Given, for this in-depth and detailed report. And start off with my comments around the first bullet and base system access, and whether it was adequate or inadequate would have been better placed at the end, because I do see that exactly what I was talking about is addressed through the infrastructure replacement fee that is suggested. I suppose one comment might be that in that respect, the first billing line item based system access actually might more properly be called something like system operation. And in that respect, I like the idea of it because it is transparent, and it's important that the community, when they look at their bill, is able to see, okay, this is what it costs to operate the system, operations on an ongoing basis. So perhaps access fee or something like that is a little bit of a misnomer, where access really is probably contained within the first and the third bullet. Another advantage to breaking it out this way is we have seen from time to time grant programs available to address infrastructure, and probably almost always grants, when available, are to address infrastructure. So with a system like this, if we obtained a grant to help upgrade our wastewater treatment plant, we would already pretty much know where we should put that money, so that we would know where consumers might see the benefit on their monthly billing. So overall, aside from maybe a question of do we have the right names for these points, I'm in favor. I agree with moving forward on this basis. I don't want us to lose sight of the really important questions and provisos that I mentioned earlier, where I think we have to face the question of whether funding the wastewater treatment system fairly heavily through water consumption fees is appropriate. We all acknowledge that our water system, per se, our freshwater system, is relatively inexpensive to operate. The devil is in the cost of wastewater treatment. So I'm leery about basing too much of the support for the wastewater treatment system on water consumption fees. But I'm quite happy to proceed on this basis and see what the next iteration of conversations would look like.
Thank you. Mr. Given, are we at the point of making a recommendation here, or do we have more requested information?
Well, Councillor Janot, I leave that to the council acting as committee. The recommendation here, and I think the first, I'm hearing a little bit of support for something different for a second motion, but the first motion, administration is still recommending that committee recommend council approve the utility rate model with the following component charges: the base system access. And again, sorry, I'll just pause to say that names can be massaged later on, but we are talking at a conceptual level. The committee recommend council approve the utility rate model with the following component charges: base system access, tiered consumption, and infrastructure replacement. I think that's still our recommendation to you. I am hearing that there is maybe a desire for some more dialogue around the implications of that. And maybe there would be a follow-up motion directing administration to develop some other kind of report that is in alignment with the model and those three components. But there's sort of two bits. One, we're asking, are those three parts, names aside, the right three parts? And if so, what do we want to do from there? What do we want to do from there? Maybe to ask administration to come back and say, okay, so what does it look like if we actually apply these? Or the what do we do from there might be to say that this council has done its work in developing the components of the model, and it's up to the next council to decide how to apply those components at budget time next year. And that's why we have some alternatives in the report, and we're open to any other alternatives that council may have about what you want to do next. But the first part of the recommendation is the committee recommend council endorse those three components or some other set of components.
Thank you. I think we're quite prepared to follow the administration's presentation or recommendations on this. Mayor Ireland, please.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor Janot. I am then prepared to make a motion that committee recommend that council approve the utility rate model with the following component charges as presented. That is the base system access, tiered consumption, and infrastructure replacement. So a recommendation from this committee to council. So it'd come back for a decision at a regular council meeting.
Thank you for that motion to recommend. Any more comments, Councillor Demota?
Well, if that motion is on the floor now and we're debating it, then I'm ready to debate my position. I'm not for recommending this to council. I would like to have a recommendation come to council after public consultation of some sort. So have these three presented to the community with the potential of addressing other opportunities, and maybe addressing the percentage construct of each if that was so desired by the committee. So I think that there needs to be another step, whether we're going to strike a task force or provide some public engagement. So for me, I think that would be the healthiest process, because right now we're making a decision. We would be making a decision to recommend to council without public consultation on these three matters. And there could be alternatives, and I'm willing to hear what the appetite of the stakeholders is. Thank you.
Thank you. So that is your input on the debate of the motion, Councillor Butler.
Thank you very much. I appreciate Mayor Ireland putting the motion forward. However, I'm not satisfied that we are at the point that council would approve the utility rate model. It says the utility rate model, and we don't have a utility rate model here. What we have is, I think, a bare framework for a utility rate model. So I would be more comfortable with a motion saying something like this: that committee direct administration to develop a draft utility rate model with the following component charges as presented.
Is that a friendly amendment? Will Mayor Ireland accept that? I think it's important to bring it forward, start moving, open the discussion. So I'm not sure whether it's at the committee level or at the council level, but I think it's very important to discuss this as much as possible to inform the public before we go to a public meeting. Myself. Comments. So Mayor Ireland, you willing to? Okay, go ahead. I think Councillor Keller-Hampy just raised her hand before you. So go ahead, Councillor Keller-Hampy.
I like the idea of it coming as a framework, and I do agree with Councillor Demota. Back last December, we had a number of the businesses and the Chamber of Commerce come forward and express that they would like input into the utility framework development. And I do believe that we do need to put it out there and get input from our business partners because they requested it. I think it's fair to go back and say, this is what we're proposing. They were totally against what we have proposed. And I would hate for us to go through all this work and then for it to fail at the table again.
Councillor Butler.
Suggestions that are have been made by Councillor Demota and Councillor Keller-Hampy to allow for public input is exactly one of the reasons that I don't think we are yet at the stage of even considering approving a model. I think public input would best be obtained once we have some sort of a draft model for the public to look at. We could go to public input process now, but there's not that much to talk about. There's 3 points. And until we understand how those points would be fleshed out and some of the more nuanced considerations that we talked about here might be addressed, I think it would be a little premature. And we invite input at any time, including now, and we are in the public. So I'm not suggesting that we don't want public input, but I think we can take another step and then talk about, well, should there be some separate public engagement process? So that, again, it's exactly those reasons that motivate me to suggest that we direct administration to develop a draft utility rate model. I'm deliberately putting the word draft in there. And then we can see where we stand.
Thank you for that. Mayor Arlen.
Thank you, Deputy Mayor. I'll go back to the question that you asked about whether I would accept that as a friendly amendment. It depends a bit on whether the chair sees it as having potential for a friendly amendment. But I will say this, I understand the points that are being made, and particularly the change of wording suggested by Councillor Butler. My intent in making the motion, and I did overlook the word "the," and I meant to address that. And I would be quite prepared to change that to a recommendation from committee that council approve a utility rate model with those three components. It's a very conceptual idea. I appreciate the comments about public engagement, but we have been at this for many months. We had a long session last fall, which ended, I think, in our inability to make a decision on December 15th on essentially whether these should be the components. And we got hung up, as Councillor Butler said earlier, on the detail. But in all of that time, we have not heard from the public about the components, the base components of a model based on connection, consumption, and capital replacement. My intent in making the motion was that if it passed, if we were prepared to recommend to ourselves as council that be the core components of a model, then I intended to make a follow-up motion, which would be a direction to administration not to come back with a detailed rate model, but to come back with another conceptual model about the apportionment of these three elements. So how much should be attributed to the connection fee, how much of the operation cost should be connected to consumption, and how will we deal with recapitalization. Again, it's pretty high level stuff. It's not down to the rates. It's not down to come back with a draft bylaw or anything like that, which still gives us ample opportunity, I think, for public engagement. But I see this as a tiered process, if you will. Start with the broad parameters. And I am quite prepared to say those three components are what we have to look at. But the next question is, in what proportion? Again, that's fairly conceptual, but that would be an opportunity to start engaging. So I would like to see some motion, but not direct administration to start working on detailed plans until we sort out some of the other questions of principle. So that's where I stand. So with your consent, I would change my initial motion to delete the word "the utility rate model" and say "a utility rate model." So we're approving in principle the development over time of a model with those components. But we're a long way from directing anybody to put pen to paper and come up with a model.
Thank you very much. That is acknowledged. I think that we want to proceed here so that we all agree on basically the concept, model, whatever that's being recommended in item number 1. Is there any more comments before we vote on this motion? Councillor Demota.
I think Councillor Butler had his hand up before me, but I can speak quickly. And okay, thank you. I just wanted to say that, I understand what the mayor has stated, and also what, I like the concepts there. And as long as the intention is at some point to engage the public, and I will acknowledge, yes, it's been in front of us for a while, and community members have had the chance to write to council or discuss it with us, but I don't feel like we engaged them properly to do so. And when things are just kind of left, you know, on the back burner for a while, we're not really engaging the public in a proper way. So I think that, you know, I understand the comments made. I'm willing to move forward with this and vote in favor of, you know, what's been recommended, as long as the intent is there for future consideration to have public debate and or input. Thank you.
Thank you for that. This is in the early stage, so I'm sure that your comments will be considered in the future. Councillor Butler, did you have any more comments?
Thank you. Yes. So it's all in a word. It changes it completely if we say a utility rate model. So I'm happy enough with that. I guess my question then would be, so what would be the outcome of this motion? So would we then, what I didn't want to see was a utility rate model come before council at the next council meeting, and then we're into the details already. So would we then have a motion at council to approve a as yet undefined utility rate model, or would this recommendation now just sit there so that when it comes back to council at some future time, we will have on the books a recommendation that the model we ultimately approve should be structured with these three framework points? So to you, Mayor Ireland, and to Mr. Given, what would be the specific outcome of this motion?
Thank you for that, Councillor Butler. Through Councillor, or pardon me, Deputy Mayor Journeau, to you. I would say the latter of those two options. We will today, by this recommendation, simply indicate that we've accepted that a model can be developed with those components, but I would suggest that the next matter for committee today would be a direction to administration to come back with a report dealing with the apportionment between those three factors. And sometime after that, we'll get to a more detailed discussion on rates. But that's the way I saw it unfolding.
Thank you. I think we've had enough discussion on the steps or the ideas on how this can move forward. I'm sure that Mr. Given and his administration has a good understanding of the comments made. Overall, I think we're prepared to take a vote on this recommendation. Can I have a show of hands? All in favor of this recommendation as presented with the word change A from that? And that is carried as everybody has voted in support. Before we close this matter, Mayor Ireland, you had sort of made a comment that you would make a second recommendation or a motion, or are you, go ahead.
Yeah, I fully intended to do that. Yes, thank you, Deputy Mayor Journeau. The recommendation from administration was twofold, but with respect to the second matter, I would not make that motion, but I would make a motion that committee direct administration to bring forward a report discussing the implications of the relative weighting between the three utility rate components.
Thank you for that. That's fairly straightforward. And I think that I see a nod by Mr. Given that is acknowledged and understood. So was this a motion, Mayor Ireland? Sorry, we're just, it's a motion. Okay, so you've all heard the motion. Can we proceed, or is there debate on this? I see no comments, so therefore we'll call the question. All in favor? Some reluctancy there, but everybody has voted in favor. So Mr. Given, you have all you need on here. I thank you. You did indicate it would be lengthy, and we have just about consumed the hour. Now we can move to item 8.4, which was a request from Councillor Demota for a report on paid parking, which is being implemented shortly. Mr. Given, can you provide us with some information?
Well, I think I'll leave it to Councillor Demota. He asked to have this item added, and I just will leave it to him since he added it first to describe what it is that he was looking for, whether he's looking for a report today, for one in the future. But I should defer to Councillor Demota to start.
That's in order. Thank you very much for that. Go ahead, Councillor Demota.
Okay, well, I think that maybe just to propose a motion that committee direct administration to present a status report and update and an update on the paid parking pilot project at the next committee of the whole meeting.
I don't understand. Well, maybe before I get clarification here, Mr. Given, go ahead.
Or the regular, sorry.
Yeah, Deputy Mayor Jeannot, I believe I understand the intent and thank Councillor Demota. That's helpful. If there is support for a motion like this, then administration would present a report. Likely at the next committee meeting would be where we would have actually a little bit of operational time of the project, where we could provide council with some initial data as well as an update about some of the changes that we've made to the service since council last discussion. I appreciate that it's a high profile item in the community, that there's going to be a high degree of interest from the community and a need for council to stay regularly apprised of how things are going. So I would thank Councillor Demota for the motion. And if committee wants to support that, what you would see is administration present a bit of a brief informational report at the next whole meeting.
Thank you. Go ahead, Councillor Demota.
Well, initially my intent was to maybe ask for an update today, but we haven't really started anything yet. And I think there's a lot of things to work through. And because it is a pilot project, probably isn't the best place to discuss it at a regular meeting. So, the idea is to maybe have, an update at the next committee of the whole, because I think, like, for me, particularly, I think that's where these updates and discussions should take place, and then what types of approaches that we might see that could be a benefit to the community going forward.
Thank you for that. There's no doubt this will be a process that will require lots of growing and probably lots of growing pains. So no doubt we'll be informed. Can we move on? Any more comments on this before we move on? Councillor Butler.
So to clarify, is the motion to request an information report at the next committee of the whole meeting?
Status report. So committee direct administration to present a status report and update on the paid parking lot project at the next committee of the whole meeting. Is that?
Well, you've thrown the word in parking lot here. Not sure.
Parking pilot.
Oh, okay.
Did I say parking lot?
Yeah, you did say parking lot. So can we, okay.
Committee
We're going all
direct
over the place.
administration to present a status report and update on the paid parking pilot project at the next committee of the whole meeting.
So this is a motion.
Yes.
Thank you. Any discussion? Show of hands, all in favor? That is carried. Thank you. Any comments before? I know I moved kind of quickly there, but any final comments? No. Let's move on to the agenda. Item 9, correspondence. None that I've seen in the agenda. Anything to comment on other correspondence? No. Mayor Arlen, the look on your face here. Do you have any comments? You're probably dealing with a lot.
I do not. I was just looking at the length of the motion action list.
Oh, I see. Okay, well, let's move on to item 10, motion action list.
Sure. Thanks, Deputy Mayor Journeau. Well, to ease Mayor Ireland's concern I'm imagining that's where that comes from, is a place of concern for administration. But I can advise that administration would recommend that items, we can have 3 items on the first page that would be deleted. The targeted boards and committees review, I believe administration has delivered that. It, of course, would be replaced by the additional work that arises of developing the policy, but that item specifically has been completed. Additional work arises, and that would show up on the next motion action list. The policy development and review item has been completed and delivered by administration. And again, council has set direction on which policies should be reviewed, and so those would come as a matter of course. But this item can be deleted. The principles for the utility rate bylaw item could be deleted. Again, recognizing that the work is not done and the issue is not dropped, that the new work that has been assigned by council will replace this item, but that one that arose from the strategic priorities meeting can be deleted. And I wanted to provide a very brief update on the community garden alternative sites item. Back in May, at the end of May when that was discussed, there was a desire from council for administration to engage with the local food society to understand whether we could find something for this season. Administration has engaged with them. We're talking with them on an ongoing basis. They indicated that they were that it was not practical to have additional sites for use in this year, and so that's why you see us recommending a new date of September. So we would go through the season, we'll have some discussion with them, and would be in a place as we head into the fall to make some recommendation on alternative sites, along with the specific request around expansion near their current site. So just wanted to apprise council of that update around the timing of that issue. And other than that, I believe that you will see that all of the items are on track, and if there is a need to extend a date, then administration would apprise you of that when we present the motion action list at a regular meeting, just like I have now. So we would recommend a motion to update the motion action list with the changes as noted.
Thank you. May I have a motion to that effect? Councillor Kelleher MP, thank you. Discussion? I have a bit of a comment that's secondary on the item called Bike Skills Park. And I'm not sure if I missed a conversation, but the word bike skills seemed to imply that you have to have a certain amount of skills before you could participate in that. And I know it's a private club that's going to run it. I'm not sure. I'm just looking at the wording here to wording that may discourage people from using and enjoying this park.
Thanks, Deputy Mayor Journeau. This is why the motion action list can be helpful if we need to clarify understanding. Gives us an opportunity to do so. I think the term bike skills park is one that's generically used for this type of facility pretty much everywhere. And the suggestion is it is an area where you can go to improve and hone your skills no matter what your level of skill is. So for me, I might take only the small bumps to start, but somebody who has more skill would be able to take the larger parts. But it is a generic term, and that is what the Cycling Association called it. And so that's why it's reflected that way in the motion action list.
Thank you for that. Councillor Butler.
Well, Councillor Jeannot, I'm now a little concerned about the look on your face, but I think you can probably rest assured that they'll let you in to the Bike Skills Park.
I do need development in that skill, and many others, by the way. Thank you. Did we have a motion on here, right? To accept? Did we vote? Might we vote now? Show of hands, all in favor. I see a big grin on many. Get with it, Chairman. We are now item 11, council representation on various boards and upcoming meetings. Standard item. Who would like to proceed with that first? All at once, please. Councillor Demora.
Well, just bringing culture and rec back into the mix. We decided because we have new board members and there's still a lot of information to discuss that we've added. We usually break for the summertime, but with holidays concerning administration and other people, that we're still going to meet this month, and I think we're aiming for the 29th of July. And again, maybe I might extend an invitation to Mr. Given and or Ms. Nadon to maybe come and speak and talk about what may be in the mix of the process going forward, and maybe get some feedback from the members there on what they'd like to see, so that we might have a better educated process on what council should be doing with the future of committees. That's just I'm putting the invitation out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Mayor Arlen, go ahead.
I have an upcoming museum board meeting this evening, and it will be our first opportunity to meet in person after many, many months, as we will be doing as council next week. I also want to alert council and administration that a consultant who has been doing work for the West Yellowhead Regional Waste Management Authority will be seeking to make a presentation to council sometime during the summer. So the board of the Regional Waste Management Authority has determined to move forward with a different governance structure. And as members of that, it's going to be important for us to have a full understanding of that. The board approved a change of direction, but contingent on ratification from all of the member municipalities. So I think I sent an email some number of weeks or maybe even a couple of months ago to alert council that this would be coming. And I can now tell you that it will be coming in the next month or thereabouts. So just be prepared that we will be looking at something on a regional basis for the continuation of waste management services in and around Jasper.
Thank you. Any other comments? Sorry, any other reports on council participation on boards and committees? It's summer, so great. Let's move on to the next item. Upcoming events. It's summer, there should be lots. Any word on the, is there a folk festival or anything like that? I guess that's a no. Mayor Arlen, thank you.
Just a reminder, the first NETMA in many, many months, I think tomorrow evening at Kumama at Pine Bungalows. And because of a limited space, I think they require registration. So if you're interested, I think Ms. Burns sent out a note saying that she could register for you if you're interested. But the first opportunity for a social networking gathering in many months is offered tomorrow.
Thanks for that contribution, Mayor Arlen. Anything else? So looks like we're ready to move in to the next item, which is an in-camera session. So at this stage, I would like to have a motion to move into camera. It's a tie. Councillor Kelleher MP is making a motion that we move into camera. So at this stage, this concludes the meeting, the public meeting. So we will be having an in-camera discussion. We do come back for an open meeting. However, no decisions or recommendation will be made. Besides, this is committee of the whole, it's not council. So we thank the public for the participation and their attendance today. Thank you for that. And before we move into camera, do we need councillors and given another short break, or are we ready to proceed? So show of hands, all in favor of moving the camera? Thank you. So do we go into another link here?
Deputy Mayor Journeau, I've just emailed the in-camera link. It should be in all council members' inboxes, and we'll switch over to that.
Thank you. Councillor Demota, before we go here, you have some comment?
Well, I was just going to ask what the desire of council is, if we want to move in or take a half-hour break or come back at 12:45, something so that we can re-energize our brains.
Show of hands. I'm personally not in favor of a break. I'd like to proceed. Is this lengthy? Do we have any idea, Mr. Given, how long this might be?
Not particularly long, although there may be additional items the council wanted to raise with me, but
I see.
I don't have a particularly extensive list, and I can inform council that I have a meeting that has come up today with staff on a priority item at 1 o'clock. So it would be, from my schedule, better to start earlier and finish before 1.
Thank you for that. I think we will do that. So we will reconvene here as soon as we can get connected. Is this correct? Thank you. So a couple minutes.
Thank
Thanks very much.
you. Thank you, Deputy Mayor Journeau. Great job.
Oh, thank you very much. I'm still nervous from